Before we move on to the vaccine mandates in care homes, particularly, which you've done a lot of work on, I just want to ask you, do you feel that the COVID inquiry will unpick some of these questions and look into it and will mean that we perhaps don't make the same mistakes again? And do you think the World Health Organization and governments elsewhere will see the evidence that you have looked at and not repeat this sort of, will this not be a playbook for future pandemics?
In terms of the English COVID inquiry, or UK COVID inquiry, Scotland are having their own sort of one. To learn the lessons and to get answers to questions, you have to ask the questions in the first place. And from what I've seen, I haven't seen the COVID inquiry focusing on the really important questions about whether the costs of lockdowns exceeded the benefits, whether there really were significant benefits from lockdowns. There have been some exploration of that, but the people they've spoken to and have tended to be the people who are involved in those decisions. And to some extent, that's understandable. You're having an inquiry, you ask the people who were at the centre of it and who were making these decisions and giving the government advice. But the danger of that is you end up with a sort of very closed circle, and you end up with the same people who, as I would say, made these mistakes and didn't present the evidence fairly and didn't take a good enough overview and didn't analyse the evidence after the event in terms of questioning where is the evidence that these measures really have benefits. You've got those same people being asked the questions. And of course, it's hard to admit you're wrong. It's human nature. You tend to sort of rationalise and look back and try and make the evidence fit your worldview. So it's really hard, I think, to get for our UK COVID inquiry to get to the bottom of those questions. And I think part of that is the way they set up. So, you look at, for example, school closures. They have these sort of core participants, and the core participants they've chosen, these are people who have priority in terms of giving evidence and me listen to, have tended to be the organisations who were more in favour of lockdowns and school closures and more concerned about long COVID and so on. Whereas a group like Us for Them, for example, who very early on were sort of championing children and looking at the costs of school closures, weren't chosen to be one of those core participants. For me, that was very revealing about the approach the COVID inquiry was going to take, and very disappointing. So I'm not optimistic about that we will learn lessons. Am I optimistic that who will learn lessons? The World Health Organization? Absolutely not. On the other hand, I think there's a growing recognition of, and we see that with some of the politicians who, in the US and the UK, even in Australia, who are saying, well, actually, we did make mistakes. We weren't aware enough about the costs. So I think, sometimes truth is like a tidal wave, and it's sort of hard to hold back. Even if you do try to resist it, it's quite hard in the long run for truth not to win. So I think they're a little bit more optimistic in terms of an awareness of the public, of society, and of a significant number of politicians, that I think it's quite hard to go back to the same mistakes we made. It doesn't mean that people like the World Health Organization and certain scientists and certain politicians won't try to do so, but I think the job will be much harder next time.
Why do you think the World Health Organization will not change its position?
Because there's been no signs that they have learnt the lessons and about the mistakes they made in terms of the recommendations. For example, mask mandates being an obvious one, the approach to vaccination, the approach to lockdowns. Maybe we'll be wrong. Maybe there is soul searching going on with the World Health Organization, but there haven't been any strong signs of that. So,
no.
Until you see some evidence that's going to be changed, why would we think there would be change?
No, I think they have a treaty now, don't they, which is looking for lockdowns, suppression measures, mask mandates, vaccinations. I think that hasn't really changed. If they feel there's a threat to life and health that's serious enough for, I don't know who decides. Whether
I think there's some debate about that sort of World Health Organization treaty, how binding that would be on individual governments. There's certainly a push within the World Health Organization, yes, to formalise some of these, I would say, failed measures in terms of compulsory lockdowns and public health measures. So there seems to be a push in who to sort of formalise them and make them part of that pandemic. And we actually see some of that in some of the inquiries. So we saw the Australian inquiry, which you wrote about last week, very, very interestingly, identifying some of the problems with some of these measures, but also looking to the future and also taking that same approach, saying, well, okay, we've got to think about when we might want to use some of these measures before, and perhaps we need to be a little bit more cautious and only use them if they're, if there's stronger evidence, but actually they become more normalized as part of the public health experience. And I think that'd be a very backward step. We've got to be frank and say, well, actually, if anything, we should be moving in the opposite direction, and there should be more of a bias to saying, well, public health don't always get it right, governments don't get it right, and you should be more cautious before introducing compulsory measures. And there should be a sort of starting bias that we won't be going down that route of taking away basic rights and freedoms. That should be your starting point. Yeah, I'm not optimistic about the route that World Health Organization are going down.
Do you think there's vested interests or it sort of it works in the favour of the World Health Organization and other outfits to lock down? Do you think there's any element of that this suited certain people, like big tech, like big pharma? Do you think that had played any part in this decision making, or do you think it was all based on panic and a lack of clear understanding of evidence?
I don't think we can purely put it down to panic and look at understanding of evidence. You can maybe excuse that decision-making process of politicians being bamboozled by bad science and bad public health advice. I think there's a little bit more to it than that. I don't know what the underlying causes of why there's such a push within some elements of public health, both globally, World Health Organization, and also within countries, to really go and push for this very authoritarian, top-down, heavy-handed approach. There does seem to be a bias in favour of that sort of approach from some in the public health establishment. I think it's to their detriment. I think public trust in public health has been really damaged by the experience of the pandemic over the past few years. But where that, why they are so keen on that very authoritarian approach, I don't know.
And on topic, public health, trust in public health and vaccine mandates, you've done a lot of work on that. Obviously, the vaccines were put out. People still claim to this day that they save lives. There's various figures, and it depends how you cook the books. But it is widely assumed that these vaccine mandates in the country, and you've looked specifically at care homes, had a benefit in reducing mortality. You might have questioned that, and you might have seen other things that may have caused harm. Could you just talk a little bit about your work?
Yeah, sure. So if we start with, put to one side for a moment the question of whether vaccines saved lives overall, and we think about the vaccine mandate. So in England, we had a mandate for care home workers. So the government announced that care home workers would have to have at least 2 COVID vaccinations. Otherwise, they would not be allowed to be employed in care homes. And the government were also planning to push this out more broadly to health workers, to doctors and nurses. This straight away becomes more of a, it's not just a scientific issue about, how well do the vaccines work and so on. It becomes more of a policy issue. Is this likely to be good policy? And straight away, there were ethical issues. We've had a long tradition in this country of not forcing people to be vaccinated, of leaving it to their choice, even if we encourage it. This was a relatively new vaccine, so people are understandably worried, rightly or wrongly, about, are there side effects? Is this the right vaccine for me? There's also the issue of, was this ever likely to have an impact on, reducing mortality of elderly care home people who are, perhaps, are indeed the most vulnerable? And there were lots of reasons to doubt why this would have any such benefit, putting the ethics to one side. For example, we know that care home workers were tested regularly, so they were likely to, you were more likely than others to know if they had a COVID infection and will pass it on before going into work. There were quite high rates of vaccination anyway amongst the elderly, so if vaccination did reduce mortality, that sort of limits the possibility of vaccine mandates to have a benefit. There was also the possibility of, contradictory effects, so unintended consequences. So we knew that vaccination probably reduced the severity of symptoms if you did get COVID. Okay, so the danger always was that if a staff member got infected, even had they been vaccinated, they sort of were less likely to be aware of it, and perhaps more likely to go into work when maybe they shouldn't do. So there are all sorts of things going on. When you look at the evidence, vaccine mandates had a big effect. So they had a big effect in that they did cause an increase in the proportion of workers who were vaccinated. But as we know, that was partly because, so some people who didn't want to get vaccinated because they thought it wasn't of benefit to them, did get vaccinated. Others simply left the profession. So that's one of the things we looked at. And we have, it's quite a nice comparison because we could compare what happened in England with what happened in care homes in Wales, where they didn't have the mandate, and also what happened in other care sectors, outside elderly care homes where they weren't mandated. And the evidence was really strong that actually the care home mandate caused quite a lot of people to leave the profession. So we estimate
up to 18,000, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right. So that's
was
about
that 7? How much? Sorry, what percentage of the workforce?
So there's two things that are going on, of course, because remember that what happened was that people would leave the profession, they wouldn't get vaccinated, so they'd either be sacked or they would just decide not to carry on working in the care sector. Some of those would be replaced, often by agency workers or by people who did get vaccinated. Okay, so if you look net, what happened to employment overall in the care sector as a direct result of the mandates, we estimated it was around between about 14 and 18,000 fewer care home workers in elderly care homes in England because of the mandate. That's about,
and that was about 7%, up to 7% of the work.
Between 3 and 4% of the total care home and employment sector. Now you've got to remember that was a sector which was really struggling anyway. It's really hard to recruit. They were struggling because there's not enough care home spaces for elderly people who are perhaps stuck in hospitals. So it was a sector that was really struggling. And the government decided to do this measure, which they knew their impact assessments knew that it would lead to a loss of employment, and it did. It led to about 4% reduction. But that's not, remember, just the number of people who lost their jobs, who left the profession, because of, as I said, some people were replaced by people who were vaccinated. It was probably about 40,000 care workers who ended up not working because of the care home mandate, some of whom were replaced. And we also saw a big increase in the use of agency workers. Agency workers can be great, but of course, overall, there's some evidence that temporary workers and people who are sort of dropping in and out, lead to lower overall levels of care than when you have this sort of more permanent employment. So, the government was doing this really damaging policy. It did have consequences. It wasn't likely to reduce mortality. That's the other thing we looked at. Did it actually have any impact on deaths for elderly people? And the answer was no, none at all. So whichever way
that's astonishing, actually. So not only, and just correct me if I'm right, not only did these vaccine mandates in care homes lead to a loss of 40,000 care home workers, and then once those were replaced, a net loss of up to 18,000 workers in a sector that is absolutely short of workers. But you're saying that the vaccines themselves did not reduce deaths.
Okay, no. What our paper was saying, that the vaccine mandate, which affected
the vaccine mandate, right?
So that did not lead to any causal, or we could not pick up any statistically significant causal reduction in mortality. So in other words, the vaccine mandate itself did not save lives. That does not necessarily mean the vaccination, either of staff or of residents, may not have saved lives. And that's what we looked at in our most recent paper, which was published just a few weeks ago. So
let's talk about that. Yes. So the mandates didn't have an impact, so we shouldn't be doing those ever again in the same circumstances with the COVID-like illness. From your evidence, the vaccines themselves, how effective were they in care homes and more broadly, if you know, in reducing mortality? This is hotly debated, I know.
It is, and it is one of the reasons it's hotly debated. You've got different types of evidence. You've got some sort of randomized control evidence, whether you focus on individuals and you say, well, this individual who's vaccinated, does it reduce their chance of getting infected or of serious illness or death relative to somebody who was unvaccinated? And there's some studies that suggest, there's quite a big impact and reduction. One of the issues with those studies is that they tend to compare people who are vaccinated against people who were unvaccinated, but also were not previously infected from COVID. And one of the things we do know from the medical evidence is that a previous infection, particularly early on, was as protective against further infection and certainly against death and serious illness as vaccination itself. Okay, so somebody
as effective or more effective, or don't we know?
Well, probably more effective. Okay, so if anything, so there's some studies on either side of that, but let's say at least as effective as vaccination. In other words, you compared somebody who had a COVID infection and somebody who had been vaccinated, and there's an issue about how long since they'd had the infection or been vaccinated, so put that to one side, but on average, what was their reduction in risk from further infection? It was probably greater if you had previous COVID infection. Now, it may also be the case that if you had a previous COVID infection and you were then vaccinated, there was a further small increase in your sort of reduction in risk. Okay, so it doesn't mean that was necessarily nothing, but much less significant. The big change was previous infection. Now, that's one of the things where economists will tend to look at. It's not that individual risk reduction, but you look at a population level, because you can have an individual risk reduction relative to somebody who's not vaccinated and somebody who's not previously infected. But if, for example, those who are previously infected are less likely to get vaccinated because they know they've already got some protection, and that does seem to be the case, there's some evidence for that. When you look at a population level, it's not necessarily the case that the vaccinated as a whole will have a lower risk than the unvaccinated. And it's also not the case that an increase in vaccination rates will necessarily lead to a decrease in mortality risk. Also, because there's all sorts of other things that go on. There may be behaviour change. So somebody who's vaccinated may, for example, a young person, say, is vaccinated in the peak of the pandemic, think, oh, well, I'm protected, I'm not a risk to anyone else, I will take more risks. I will go out now more perhaps than I would have done, or I won't mind, I'll go and visit my elderly granny. Now, as we know, originally they thought the vaccination was going to have a big decrease in infection rates, and that doesn't seem to have held out. It may have had some small reduction in infection rates in the short run, but very quickly waned, and possibly very little at all when it came to the Omicron wave of infections. So that there was really, the idea that being vaccinated would stop you getting COVID hasn't really held up to any significant degree, hasn't held up. So if you have then people taking sort of extra risks, if you like, who are vaccinated, that may counter effect, and you may end up with vaccination leading even to an increase in infection rates amongst some groups. So there's all sorts of things that could go on. So you need both types of evidence, the sort of evidence that medics would like, looking at randomized controlled trials of individuals, and then what the sort of stuff that economists would do, looking at population levels. So that's what we did in our recent paper, again focusing on care homes, and we said, well, okay, care homes that had bigger vaccine take-up rates, did they, amongst residents or staff, did that lead to a bigger or lower COVID deaths relative to other care homes, taking account of lots of other things, because there's lots of other reasons why you might have lower or higher deaths in particular areas. Okay, so that's what we were looking at, and I won't go through the technical details, but we use some sort of machine learning techniques to try and really separate out the impact of vaccine take-up from, for example, increasing cumulative immunity, which might also reduce deaths, and looking at community infection rates, all sorts of things that were going on.